Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 341 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and I'm joined today by Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, this is a special bonus episode that we recorded to thank our patrons at patreon.com/StarQuest for their generosity in making this and all our shows at StarQuest possible. We gave them early, exclusive access, but now we're sharing it with you to show you one of the benefits of becoming a patron. Jimmy, what topics will you be covering today?
We're going to be talking about zombies, werewolves, blue orbs, the origin of COVID, D.D. Hume, tulpas, Missing 411, and a bunch more.
Excellent. So, folks, please enjoy the show. So, our first question comes from Nick Olzik. Sorry, Nick, if I mispronounce it. But Nick sends in a question that's an audio question. Here we go.
Hello, Jimmy. Thank you for your awesome show, Mysterious World. My kids and I really enjoy it. And my children have some questions for your Halloween episode. So here we go. First up, what's your name?
Nathan. I am 8 years old, and my question is, are werewolves... Wait, no. My question is, are zombies, big spiders, and zombies real? Emily, 6 years old. Are werewolves real?
All right. Those are questions from Nathan and Emily Olzik. I'm Nick Olzik Sr., and I hope you have a blessed day. Thanks for all your hard work and your wonderful show. Bye.
Okay, so first thing I want to do is thank Nick for having his children send in the questions. We weren't able to include them on the Halloween shows because those were weird question shows that had already been recorded with Catholic Answers Live, but I wanted to get his children an answer quickly. Unfortunately, we had this patron question show coming up, so that's why we're using the question here. In regard to the first question, are zombies big spiders? Well, not always. So normally zombies are thought of as people who either are mentally damaged or have died and are being animated somehow. There are different kinds of zombies, and normally zombies are thought of as humans, but it's not impossible that you could have a big spider that also became a zombie. It just wouldn't be the normal type of zombie. And by the way, we have an episode of Mysterious World, where a couple of episodes actually, where we talk about real life zombies. And those are episodes 159 and 160. So you can get to them by going to mysterious.fm/159 and mysterious.fm/160. And your father can take a listen to them and let you know if he thinks that they would be good for you to listen to too. In regard to the other question about are werewolves real, well, they're in the sense of people who transform into wolves. That's probably not real. I don't have any good evidence that people literally transform into a wolf or into something that's halfway between a human and a wolf. But there are people who can reasonably be mistaken for werewolves. There is a condition that a few people have that causes hair to grow all over every inch of their bodies. So if you look at their face, they've just got hair all over their face. There's no bare skin. And historically, these people have been thought of by some as werewolves. In fact, there's a very famous one from history who was like a nobleman in Europe. And you can hear all about werewolves in episode 90 of Mysterious World. So you can get to that by going to mysterious.fm/90, and your father can listen to that and tell you if he thinks that would be good for you to listen to too.
Very good. Then our next question comes from Carrie, who says, your podcast is one of the only ones that I've heard address blue orbs in a meaningful way, and I'm writing about our own recent experience with them. But first, a question. Are there more sightings of cryptids now than before, or are we just more aware of the sightings because of social media, or are there other reasons? And then his story. In September 2024, I was with my 2 adult children on the island of Naxos in the Greek islands. We were walking on the beach back to the hotel from the city when we noticed some blue lights in the water that were moving around. They were moving like spotlights back and forth without the upward shine out of the water. The area covered by the movement was probably 10 to 15 feet wide. We wondered out loud if it was bioilluminating substances. My son volunteered to go out into the water to check it out. He said the lights were about 15 yards out and about 3 feet underwater. The 2 lights were circling in a figure 8, and sometimes they would meet up and circle together, creating a brighter light. Then they would separate and meander through the figure 8. When he got about 12 feet away, one of the lights stopped and made a beeline right for him. When it shot straight for him, it went under him and went out. That's when he turned back to shore and booked it back. Editorial insert here. By the use of your word booked it, I'm guessing you're from New England, but that's that's a personal no.
No, we used that in Arkansas when I was in high school.
Oh, really? I always thought it was like a New Englandism, booking it back, but maybe Gen X anyway. In any case, Carrie continues, he said he's never swam as fast as he did then. I can imagine. When he got out of the water, he said that they were just orbs. There was nothing in them. No fish, nothing, just spheres. We walked back to our hotel without issue, talking about the strange light all the way home. Anyway, I just thought I'd share and ask my question at the same time.
Yeah, so in terms of the question, I think that there probably is more awareness of cryptids on the part of ordinary people because of social media today, because it makes it so easy to spread stories and videos and stuff like that. Whether there are actually more reports being given to cryptozoologists, that I couldn't say. Your experience with blue orbs is very interesting for people who may wonder when we've talked about them. We first introduced the concept in episode 36 on Skinwalker Ranch, which is at mysterious.fm/36. And we also devoted a whole episode to them in episode 202. So that's mysterious.fm/202. And I'd love to be able to analyze the experience. Unfortunately, not having been there, not being able to capture, photographs of exactly what was going on, I can't really say, but it's a fascinating experience, and I understand your son's reaction.
Excellent. And then Kenneth K. asks the next question. What are Jimmy's thoughts on the origins of COVID-19? Does he think it has a natural origin, or was it the result of a lab leak?
Well, I've done some research on this, and my opinion is that it was very likely the product of a lab leak, that it was a virus that had undergone development in the lab as part of, there's a procedure that is sometimes used to try to beef up viruses in case we ever encounter a beefed up virus in the wild. And I think it's a really stupid procedure that needs to be banned. But based on the evidence that I've seen, I think it was likely originating in a lab leak. I'm not 100% convinced of that, but I think that's a strong likelihood. And I plan to do an episode on that in the future of Mysterious World.
And then Father Jeff H. asks, what's your take on the Chelyabinsk accident and the Etherian Society? It's in Chapter 7 of Mahaffey's Atomic Accidents.
Yeah, so Jim Mahaffey's book, Atomic Accidents, is an awesome book, and I'm a big fan of anything Mahaffey writes. I've read Atomic Accidents multiple times, but it's been a while. The event that Father Jeff is referring to is a nuclear accident that happened in the late 1950s in the Soviet Union around a city called Chelyabinsk 40. And the first reference to the accident in the West was by the leader of a UFO religion called the Aetherius Society. I'm afraid my memory is too fuzzy to have an opinion of it at the moment, but I'll reread this section and see if there's a basis for a future episode there.
Sebastian W. asks, was Jesus a D.D. Hume home on steroids?
Yeah, so D.D., his name is spelled home, but it's pronounced Hume. And his name was Daniel Douglas Hume. He was a 19th century physical medium. That means he wasn't so much interested in having conversations with spirits as allowing spirits to demonstrate their presence through physical phenomenon. And he was reportedly able to do prodigious feats involving psychokinesis, or PK, like levitating off the floor of a house, going out a window, and coming back into a lower floor of the house. Hume was tested by prestigious scientists of the day, and his powers seemed genuine. They didn't catch him faking, and they put him under some rigorous tests. We will have a future episode on him. Now, Sebastian asks if Jesus could be understood as a kind of D.D. Hume on steroids, by which I assume he means that Jesus had psychokinetic abilities that were stronger than those of D.D. Hume. And if that's what he means, then I'd say the answer is yes. Jesus did accomplish psychokinetic effects that were comparable to D.D. Hume, like when he ascends into heaven or walks on water. But Jesus also accomplished psychokinetic effects that went beyond what D.D. Hume was reported to be able to do, like when Jesus rearranged the atoms in water to turn it into wine. That's an incredibly powerful form of psychokinesis, to be able to systematically manipulate a large volume of matter on the subatomic scale that way. But Jesus was backed by divine power in a way that D.D. Hume was not. Jesus did miracles, acts of God, whereas D.D. Hume just did preternatural feats. So Jesus was also unlike D.D. Hume in that regard.
All right. And Martin R. now asks, hi, Jimmy and Dom. I would like to know what Jimmy thinks of the idea that the pagan gods could be tulpas, or beings created through a human collective unconscious. Does anyone seriously consider this idea, or is it just an idea in fictional works?
Okay, first I should probably mention what a tulpa is. This is a concept that is found in East Asia, where some folks claim that it's possible to invest so much mental energy in something you're thinking about that it not only manifests in the world, but it kind of takes on a life of its own. And that's what a tulpa is. In other circles, like in the Theosophical Society, tulpas are often referred to as thought forms. It's kind of a thought that takes on a life of its own. And it's not something that has to be a product of collective consciousness among humans. Supposedly, there are people who can project tulpas by themselves without other people involved. One difficulty for tulpas, and by the way, I do plan to have a future episode on them. I've been gathering research materials on them, but one problem for them is evidential, in that no one, so far as I know, has been able to bring a tulpa into the lab to study it. So we have anecdotal accounts, but we don't have laboratory studies on these things. Having said that, Martin wants to know, could the idea that pagan gods be tulpas, is that something that's been seriously considered, or is it just an idea from fiction? And I have seen it in fictional works. It appears occasionally, where you'll have in fantasy works, for example, the idea that the gods are created by the belief of their worshipers, and then as the number of worshipers dwindles, the power of the god dwindles until the god ceases to exist. And in this scenario, the gods are basically tulpas or thought forms. It wouldn't surprise me if some people in the real world have proposed that, but I'm not aware of people in the real world proposing that. It's also different, I would note, than the biblical view, which sees the gods of the nations as angelic beings that were put in charge of the nations, and some of them went bad and demanded people to worship them instead of the true God. Personally, I'm skeptical of the idea of tulpas or thought forms, but I'm still researching them, and we'll discuss them in a future episode.
Tim H. asks, any thoughts or plans on touching on missing 411? I don't recall it having been mentioned yet.
Well, we haven't covered the idea yet. At least we haven't covered it in depth. I'll just tell you what I think, though, and I do plan on covering it in a future episode. I personally am open but skeptical toward the claims made by David Paulides, who is the creator of the Missing 411 series. The series involves people going missing from national parks in unusual circumstances. Like he will, propose that something mysterious, paranormal, or UFOs, or something supernatural, something really weird is happening to these people. And I'm open to his claims, but I think they need to be critically evaluated, like all claims. And I'm not sure that he's discovered anything actually paranormal here. What he may well have discovered, is some reported deficiencies in the way that national parks handle it when people go missing. I've heard a number of interviews with him, and it seems to me that, if the National Park Service is handling this the way he describes it, then they have not been doing a good job when it comes to adequate reporting and investigation. In any event, I plan to look further into it and have an episode on it in the future.
Teresa M. writes, Grace, age 10, one of my 3 children, said that she almost knew that a fire would spread and she'd eventually know about this, and at the same time she felt creeped out. It was about 9:40 p.m. and we had just finished our 4th of July party, and only about 20 minutes before is when she had felt that weird feeling. I had just noticed a text message from our good friends that a fire was happening just a few streets away from their house. They had to get the people out of the house, then just a few minutes later, they texted back and said, the fire spread into the woods. Then we heard the fire department drive past, and eventually it got put out. Grace is very excited to tell you and have it on the show, of course. If you do so, what do you think about this scenario?
Well, it's a very interesting experience, and it would be classified as what's known as a precognitive experience, where you get information about the future. Many people report such things. I've even had precognitive experiences myself. There's no way for me to investigate this at a distance after the fact, but it is a very interesting experience. It goes along with other experiences that other people have had. And sometimes when it happens for the first time, people do get freaked out, but there's really nothing to be afraid of here. And I would suggest that if Grace has future experiences like this, that she instantly make a record of them and then see whether they come true. And if they happen regularly, every so often, that's notable, and it provides more evidence for precognition in her case than just a single experience would. But the basic category this one falls into is precognitive experiences.
Marcin D. writes, I'd really love to hear Jimmy's take on the not-so-recent outburst of AI. Can AI gain consciousness, or maybe it already has it? If so, can it go to heaven?
I think that AI can potentially one day surpass humans in computing power. That is the ability to manipulate information. So, in terms of smarts, I think it can get smarter than us in functional terms. It'll be able to process information better than we can. At least I think that's possible. However, I don't think it's possible that AI can truly become conscious. And thus, I don't think it can go to heaven. I think it's just very good at, or can become very good at symbol and information manipulation. You know, you input some symbols or some information, and it can recombine that in a way that's potentially better than the way humans can recombine information. But that doesn't mean it understands the material that it's manipulated. There's, in fact, a famous thought experiment called the Chinese room experiment, where you have a person who speaks English and only English in a room where he is being fed slips of paper that have Chinese writing on them. And he doesn't know what the Chinese writing says, but he can look it up in a dictionary that has Chinese writing, and then it'll also have in Chinese an appropriate response. So like if you get this symbol, you need to reply with this symbol, or this set of symbols comes in, you reply with this set of symbols. And then he can send that reply message out. And it looks to an outsider who speaks Chinese like they're talking to a native speaker of Chinese who understands their language. But really, the guy in the Chinese room has no knowledge of Chinese. All he's got is the ability to look up an appropriate response in a resource. And I think, and he has no actual understanding of Chinese. And I think that's the way that AI works. It's good when you put in certain symbols at manipulating those symbols and giving you a reasonable response, but it itself has no consciousness of what these symbols mean.
Becky H. asks, is there any evidence or logical reason that what we consider paranormal or even supernatural, excluding God himself, couldn't be a normal part of the world functioning as designed, but we don't understand it yet? I've heard a theory that even miracles are natural functions sped up by a means we can't understand.
Okay, so I need to distinguish some terminology here. In the proper theological sense, a miracle involves an act of God. And so true miracles, meaning things that God himself does, are not caused by the laws of nature. When it comes to things that are done by people other than God, like maybe angels, they wouldn't be considered true miracles in the theological sense. They would be considered because they're not supernatural. The word supernatural in the proper sense refers to God alone, but it's also used more broadly than that. And so if anything is coming from a source that is higher than human nature, like angelic nature, then that also could be called supernatural. It's just not in the proper sense. In the proper sense, people would refer to angelic actions as preternatural. Praeter means apart from, so these would be apart from nature, but not from God, not supernatural. Or you could also call them paranormal. So if true miracles that are done by God don't involve the laws of nature, what about other paranormal things like angelic actions or psychic functioning on the part of humans, which is also paranormal? Well, those could be undiscovered parts of the world around us, and parapsychologists generally treat psychic functions as natural abilities of the human mind, which from a Christian perspective would mean that they're abilities that God built into us. And that theory has been supported, for example, by Father Alois Feisinger, who was a 20th century abbot who was also a parapsychologist. And he wrote about this. He proposed that what we think of as psychic functions are actually remnants of the preternatural gifts that Adam and Eve had before the fall. And so they just don't work as well as they would have before the fall because human nature has been damaged, but they're still part of human nature. And parapsychology, even though it's got evidence they exist, it doesn't currently have a theory to explain exactly how they work. Just like at one point, geologists knew about a lot of different kind of stones, but they didn't really know how stones formed. And in the same way, today, parapsychologists have evidence for psychic powers existing, but they don't have a good explanation for how they work. That's a level of theory that hadn't yet been developed. In any event, if you'd like to hear more about these concepts, you might want to check out episode 79 of Mysterious World at mysterious.fm/79 on religion, magic, psychic phenomena, and science. And then when it comes to angels, well, they are created beings, and so they're part of the created world, and any actions that they perform would also need to conform to the general laws of creation. And if you define all of creation as nature, then they would be part of nature. They would be part of an undiscovered part of nature, and their actions would be in accordance with the broader natural laws. On the other hand, if you restrict the term nature to the visible universe that we can detect with our senses and our scientific instruments, then they would be from beyond nature, but they would still, and thus their actions would not be a product or not necessarily be a product of natural law, but they would still be in accord with overall laws of creation, even though we're defining creation in this case as broader than just the natural world.
Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by the debut novel Pilgrims by M.R. Leonard, Alien Invasion, the Catholic Church, and a failed Latin teacher. Pilgrims is inspired by Augustine's Confessions and tells the story of a washed-up Latin teacher who gets thrust into the center of humanity's first contact with extraterrestrials who land at the Vatican and claim to be Catholic. Mysterious World fans who enjoy compelling science fiction from a Catholic point of view can find Pilgrims wherever books are sold and at mrleonardauthor.com. And for those who enjoy audiobooks, Pilgrims is also available as a full multicast production. This StarQuest show is also brought to you by Exodus 90 and the Exodus 90 app. Men, we are called to share the hope and joy of Jesus Christ. Our family, friends, and community desperately need us to imitate our Lord to be radically present and available. What if you intentionally live this Advent season differently, focused not on buying Christmas presents, but sharing the loving presence of Jesus Christ? We want to invite you to join us on the Exodus 90 app and break out of the religion of the world. Join the men of Exodus 90 and Monsignor James Shea, president of the University of Mary, who's our spiritual guide for Advent this year on the Exodus 90 app. Together, we will rediscover the hope that God lays out for us in the coming of His Son into the world. Go to exodus90.com/SQPN to learn more about Advent on the Exodus 90 app. That's exodus90.com/SQPN to join men from around the world this Advent starting December 1st. Be radically free in Jesus Christ this Advent. Joseph has a few questions. First, what do you think of the megalodon sightings in California? Second, say all my Lego men suddenly came to life. Would I be considered omnipotent to them, as I could create, change, or destroy anything in their world easily? Third, if we find a way to clone dinosaurs, would we be able to make the Indominus Rex? And lastly, do Daleks have souls? I love the podcast.
Okay, Joseph. So I haven't looked into recent reports of megalodons in California. For folks who may not be aware, megalodons are a prehistoric shark that was enormously huge. And we find their teeth on the ocean floor. And we find so many of these teeth that some people think megalodons are still out there. There is a counter argument to that, though. I would personally love it for megalodons to still be real and they're still be alive. And there are, areas of underwater oceans that we haven't really yet explored. We don't know all the creatures that are out there. So I do plan on having a future episode about megalodons, and I've actually seen some reports of sharks that are even larger than megalodons. By the way, the word megalodon, so it comes from Greek roots that mean giant tooth, and that's how we know about them, as we find their teeth. In any event, I do plan to cover them in the future. When it comes to your Lego men, you would not be omnipotent, because omnipotent means the ability, not just the ability to, move stuff around, which is what you do with Lego men. It involves the ability to actualize any state of affairs that does not involve a logical contradiction. If it's short of that, it is not omnipotent. Omni means all, potent means powerful, and so omnipotent means you've got all possible power. You can do anything that's logically possible. You can't make a four-sided triangle or a square circle, but you can do anything that doesn't involve a contradiction. And you couldn't do that with respect to your Lego men. You would be very powerful in comparison to the Lego men, and if you were able to give them life, well, then you would be able to create living beings, but you're manipulating stuff that already exists. So you wouldn't be a true creator. You would be what's known as a demiurge. Demiurgos in Greek means craftsman. And so some of the Greek philosophers would talk about a god who was a demiurge, a craftsman that made the world out of pre-existing material. And if you made a world of Lego men out of Legos, you would be a craftsman, but not a creator from nothing, and thus not an omnipotent one. Indominus Rex is a fictional hybrid dinosaur from the Jurassic World series, and if we got enough DNA from dinosaurs to usable DNA from dinosaurs to be able to clone them, then it would be hypothetically possible that we could manipulate that DNA to produce something like Indominus Rex in the real world, although it might also be impossible, and it might also be really stupid to do that. Having said that, Daleks do have a living component, namely the Khaled mutant that is inside of them and that drives the armored vehicles that you see. So they do have souls, because Khaled mutants are alive and all living things have souls. They're just hate-filled souls in their case.
Right. William W. asks, a good friend of mine is very interested in the divine will movement of Luisa Picaretta. I know very little about it, but it strikes me as contrary to what I know of the Catholic faith. I heard something about a third fiat. I wondered if you could point me in the right direction regarding how to respond to him. Thank you for your time.
Well, the situation is complicated by two factors. The first is that Luisa Picaretta currently has a cause for canonization opened, and she's currently a servant of God, meaning that the diocesan phase sort of has been completed, but she has not yet been declared a venerable or a blessed or a saint. Secondly, this is the second complicating factor, there are apparently some seriously confusing things in her write-ins. And in January of 2024, the cause for her canonization was suspended by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith because of the confusing stuff in her write-ins. However, this suspension was reportedly lifted in June of 2024, so I guess they got the clarifications they were looking for, or otherwise decided to let the process proceed. The matter is partially complicated by the dialect of Italian that she wrote in. It's apparently different than what most Italians speak, and that's made some of what she says hard to understand. My understanding is that there has been a request from the competent authorities not to distribute her write-ins until a more thorough study and a better translation and critical edition of them can be produced, because if you just read the translations that are out there now, they will contain things that are problematic. So any current write-ins that you see may have serious errors in them, at least partly due to the translation, so caution is advised.
Misty K asks, why are Protestants so militant about Catholicism? I've come out of all of the Protestant denominations, and I don't get it.
Well, not all Protestants are militant about Catholicism. Today, some of them are quite friendly to Catholics. So you have to ask those Protestants who are antagonistic to Catholics why they're antagonistic. Now, part of the reason is they would certainly say, well, I disagree with Catholicism. But if you're asking for why do you show this particular passion, I'd have to say, well, I think they think those who are very antagonistic to Catholicism must think that Catholicism is not just wrong, but very wrong, or really most sincerely wrong. And that could be responsible for the passions. It's also possible to answer this question from a sort of psychological, historical perspective, and I really hesitate to do that. I do not like psychologizing the beliefs of other people. I prefer to stick to the evidence, so I do not like it, Sam I Am. But I think it's reasonable, and I think most historians, including many Protestant historians, would agree that Protestantism emerged out of a matrix where there was a need to see the Catholic Church as supremely wicked, because you had to have an explanation. If you're in Western Europe, everybody knows the Catholic Church is Jesus' church, and if you separate yourself from it, that's really sinful. So you need some way to ease that cognitive dissonance. If you're going to break away, you've got to have some good explanation. And so what happened was Protestants would accuse the Catholic Church of not being the bride of Christ, but of being the whore of Babylon, because there is this dark image that's of a woman that's parallel to the church in the book of Revelation. She's not the bride of Christ, she's the whore of Babylon. And so they would say that's what the Catholic Church is. And they would see this figure of the beast or the Antichrist and say, okay, that's who the Pope is. And so you did find early Protestant reformers adopted those views. And I think many Protestants today would admit that they did so out of psychological reasons, because those views are not supported by biblical exegesis. That is not what those passages refer to, as even Protestant scholars themselves will admit today. You know, they'll say, no, the Catholic Church is not the whore of Babylon, that's something different. And no, the Pope is not the Antichrist, that's something different. So why then would they have resorted to these interpretations if that's not what the biblical text says? Well, because there was a cognitive need to explain what the Catholic Church is if we're going to break away from it. And now that the passions of that era have cooled down, both sides can have a more neutral reassessment of these things. So even though I dislike looking at psychological explanations for things, that one is one that I think there is some evidence for that could even be agreed to by our Protestant friends.
Sarah M. asks, would it be morally licit for conjoined twins to get married and or have children, especially if they share reproductive organs?
Okay, so the purpose of having children is one of the purposes of a marriage. So if you can get married, then you can have children. That part of the question is easy. When it comes to conjoined twins getting married, there is not a church teaching on this. So we have to fall back on the principles of Catholic moral theology to try to answer the question. Presumably, it would be possible, despite the difficulties like about privacy and such that it would entail, if the twins do not share the same reproductive organs. So let's say you had conjoined twins who are joined at the top of the head. You know, there have been cases like that. Well, one twin could marry one person and one twin could marry another person. And, you know, maybe you can try to mitigate the privacy concerns by putting a barrier, you know, but it would be possible in theory, because there is a fundamental right to matrimony that is natural to humans. I mean, it requires a willing partner, but there is a right to get married unless there is a very strong reason preventing it. And mere privacy concerns caused by a physical condition like this wouldn't, in the minds of many moral theologians, would not trump the natural right to get married. And so you could presumably go ahead and get married as long as you're not sharing the same reproductive organs. If they do share the same reproductive organs, that makes the situation much more difficult to sort out. It's also possible that one twin might have reproductive organs and the other might not, because of the way they're growing out of the body or something. And you could establish these reproductive organs belong to this twin and not to this other twin. Well, in that case, the twin that has the reproductive organs could get married and have children, but the one that doesn't have reproductive organs presumably could not get married due to their inability to consummate the marriage. Because even though a marriage is valid from the moment it's contracted, you have to be able to give the marital debt, to pay the marital debt to a spouse. You have to be able to engage in reproductive behavior. And if you don't got reproductive organs, you can't do that. So that twin in that situation presumably would not be able to get married.
And then these next few questions actually come from a neighbor from a few towns over from me, which is nice. Alex S. writes, my 10-year-old son Anthony from Foxborough asks, is there entertainment in heaven?
Well, I think it's going to depend on what you mean by entertainment. Entertainment is something that we here on Earth engage in order to generate positive feelings. Now, they may be mixed with other feelings like fear, if you're watching a horror movie or something. But fundamentally, you want a pleasant experience. That's what motivates us to watch horror movies, because even though there's some fear, there's also fun and excitement and things like that. So we consume entertainment in order to generate positive emotions. And the same is true whether it's consuming a fictional narrative or playing a sport or playing a game. Really what we're after is the chance to have certain kinds of feelings that are positive. Well, in heaven, we will certainly feel positive emotions. And that would include, I assume, the ones that we associate with entertainment here on Earth. But the cause may be different. It may be that we're having all that fun in heaven just because we're in heaven and it's so awesome. And we're not doing anything in particular like watching a movie or reading a book or, playing a game or playing sports. So we'll have the positive emotions, whether we're getting them the same way or more directly, that I don't know. I would not consider it at all impossible that there would be entertainment in heaven, but I also think it's possible we could get the same emotions in another way just by being in the awesome presence of God, for example.
Alex himself has a question. He says, will people give birth on the new earth, that is, heaven after the world ends? I would think the answer is no. Would Adam and Eve have had children before the fall? I would think the answer is yes. If the new earth is like the garden before the fall, why would there have been new children in the garden before the fall, but not new children in the new earth / heaven?
Okay, so Jesus tells us that we will not be married or given in marriage in the resurrection, and that means there's not going to be any new children after the fall, because you need marriage in order to have children in God's eyes. He says, so no new children. The reason part of what he says about this is we're going to be like the angels in heaven. They don't get married. They don't have reproduction. And he doesn't spell this out, but the reason that they don't get married and reproduce is because they're immortal. And so they don't need to reproduce to keep their race going. And we're going to be immortal in the resurrection. So that's why we won't need to reproduce in order to have the human race keep going in the resurrection, because we're just going to live forever, just like the angels. So what about the situation before the fall that you asked about? Well, the command, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, happens in Genesis 1, which is before the fall occurs in Genesis 3. So it would appear that there was nothing prohibiting Adam and Eve from having children before the fall. And they could have, if they had chosen to. The way the text is written, it looks like they didn't, but they certainly could have, and it was expected that they would have children in order to fill the earth and subdue it. So why would they need children, given that they then had access to the tree of life and did not have to die? Why would they have children before the fall, even if they had never fallen? Well, because they need to do that other thing that God mentioned. There's only 2 of them in the text, and so they need to fill the earth and subdue it. And so that would be the purpose for Adam and Eve getting married and having children, even if the fall had never occurred, because they need to fill the earth and subdue it. They have more than just keeping the human race going. They could just chill out in the Garden of Eden and eat tree of life all day and stay immortal, stay alive forever. But then they're not doing that fill the earth and subdue it part. And for that, they need to reproduce. So that's why they needed to reproduce before the fall, to fill the earth and subdue it. And that's why we won't need to reproduce in the resurrection, because the human race has already grown to include more than 100 billion people at this point, and we won't need to reproduce to keep it going.
The next question comes from Rob L., who asks, I don't remember if I asked this, but what exactly is the history of SQPN, and how did Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World start?
Well, Dom, why don't you summarize the history of SQPN, and then I'll summarize the history of Mysterious World.
Okay, I'll try to do it quickly. SQPN started in 2006. That's the corporate beginning, but it has its roots earlier in the work of Father Roderick von Hogen, a priest of the Netherlands, and Greg and Jennifer Willits. Greg and Jennifer had started an apostolate called Rosary Army, which included a podcast. Father Roderick had been podcasting, and this is in the very early days of podcasting, 2006. They started 2005, I think. And so that was very early days. And there was only a few Catholic podcasters at the time. They got together and saw the value in working together in creating a podcast network of Catholics, of helping promote podcasting. And so they founded at the time, and still is called SQPN Inc., the StarQuest Production Network. And over time, it has grown and
which was originally the StarQuest Podcast Network.
Yes, it was, and yeah, right. We've since changed it to production to include things like video, like we're doing now, and other aspects. So it grew over time, and its mission has essentially stayed the same, but the way we bring about the results of that mission, or put that mission into effect, have adapted. And so we started doing conferences, the Catholic New Media Conference, starting in 2008, I think it was, where we would gather like-minded Catholics to discuss how we'd go about doing this thing, which we at the time called new media. And then over the years, we adapt. Greg and Jennifer left SQPN when they were hired by the SiriusXM network's Catholic channel to do a radio show, a daily radio program. They've since left that, but they went to go do that, and they're back doing Rosary Army, which you can hear partially sponsors Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So you can see you can see the link to that and go check out what they do. It's great. In 2015 or no, later than that, 2017, I think it was, Father Roderick, because of the difficulties of managing things across the Atlantic, he's doing his own thing now, and we fully support it. We're still friends, and really excited by the things he's doing with his continuing his apostolate in media, and then we kind of relaunched in 2018 with several new programs, including Mysterious World. So, Jimmy, you want to handle that one?
Yeah. So I became a podcaster independently. I forget the exact year, but I had a podcast called the Jimmy Akin Podcast, and for a time, it was part of the SQPN network. I mean, they carried it, but but it went into pod fade. I didn't have time. I was doing all the editing myself and all the uploading myself, in addition to producing the content. And it was too much for me to keep doing by myself. So it went into podcast fade. And then shortly before Father Roderick decided to refocus his efforts on what he was doing in Europe, Dom asked me to become a board member at SQPN. And I initially was hesitant, but Dom won me over, and so I ended up joining the board. And then after Father Roderick decided to refocus his efforts in Europe, what that meant was that all of the podcasts that he was producing were not going to be part of StarQuest anymore, because he was taking his own podcasts with him. And that left StarQuest with one podcast, which was The Secrets of Doctor Who. Well, you can't run a podcast network with one podcast. And so we had a board meeting and we started brainstorming ideas this was in 2018. We started brainstorming ideas for what new podcasts might we want to do. And I had an idea some years before. I remember thinking about it in the early 2000s when I was visiting Roswell, New Mexico. I thought, I could write a book. Could be called Jimmy Akin's Book of the Weird, where I look at different weird subjects and, classify them in terms of how probable they are to be real. Like, are ghosts real? Is Bigfoot real? And so on. And I thought, that could make the basis for an interesting podcast. And so I proposed it, and it ended up being called Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. I wasn't sure if I wanted the name Jimmy Akin, to be part of the title, because it seemed a little self-promoting, but Dom insisted, no, it's got to be called, you're part of the Brandon, your name needs to be on this. And so we started the podcast in 2018. It was very primitive in the beginning compared to what it is now, but we've been doing it ever since and have no plans to stop doing it anytime in the near future.
It's been a blast. I've enjoyed this as much as any of the listeners. So we're going to go as long as you're willing to go, Jimmy. So I hope that answers your question, Rob. We have another question from Alex S., who asks, did we land on the moon?
The answer is yes, we did. And we'll have a future episode on that. I have looked at the arguments, this is a big conspiracy and we didn't land on the moon and here's how we know that and stuff. And frankly, the arguments do not hold water. We have good evidence that we landed on the moon. In fact, we left stuff on the moon, and you can see that stuff from Earth with a big telescope. So, we did go to the moon, but we'll talk about the arguments for and against that in the future.
As one of the astronauts, someone confronted him once outside of an event he was speaking at, and
he decked him.
Lying.
Yeah,
he decked him. So it was a very funny moment. I don't condone violence, but that one was good. Becky H asks the next question: do angels and demons live outside of time like God? If they do, then do demons know their eventual defeat, and how does that affect their actions within time?
Okay, so recently I created the Jimmy Akin podcast in part to answer questions like this, especially questions that people have frequently. And I'm always getting questions about, do angels or saints exist outside of time? So I need to do an episode on that subject and show you the documents where the church says this. But the answer is no. Only God is outside of time. The reason that people seem to think that angels or saints might be outside of time is because they have the idea, well, they're in heaven and God is in heaven and God is outside of time, so they must be outside of time. And okay, that sounds reasonable on the surface, but it's actually not what happens. There's an equivocation in there about where God is. I can explain that further in a Jimmy Akin podcast episode on this subject. But what the Catholic Church teaches is God and God alone is outside of space and time. All created beings are inside of time. And so angels and demons do not live outside of time. And consequently, they do not, this is the common opinion at least, they do not have perfect knowledge of the future. They do not know it with certainty. But the demons do know about their eventual defeat. And we see evidence for that in the Gospels, because in Mark and Matthew, when Jesus goes to exorcise the Gadarene or Gerasene demoniacs, if you look in Mark's version, the demons ask of Jesus, "Have you come to torture us before the time?" So they know that they are going to be defeated in the future, and they're going to have comeuppance for all the bad stuff they've been doing. And we've actually, in a number of episodes, talked about Jewish literature that also refers to this idea as part of our Lost Scripture series. These aren't really lost scriptures, but both the book of Jubilees and the book of First Enoch refer to this, where there are these angels who fell. Jubilees is episode 319. So that's mysterious.fm/319. And we did a two-parter on First Enoch, which is episode 323 and 324. So that's mysterious.fm/323 and mysterious.fm/324, where these books of Second Temple Jewish literature that actually date from before the time of Christ refer to these fallen angels and how many of them were confined in pits under the earth, which is also mentioned in the New Testament, but how others were allowed to run free until the end of the earth, until the end of time, at which point they will get their rightful comeuppance. And so here in Mark and Matthew, we see them having an awareness of that fact. So if you want to find out a little bit more about the world of ideas, even though this isn't scripture, about the world of ideas that Jews were entertaining about this around the time of Jesus, you can check out those additional episodes.
Right. Richard Sasso asks, how is it that young children are able to acquire language so flawlessly, despite the fact that they have few or no abstract thinking skills? They often learn very complex systems that even sophisticated linguists have trouble explaining. For example, the words the, a, and an represent the English article system. They require over 100 pages of explanation in a standard advanced grammar book for linguists, but even that still does not completely cover the topic, which is much more complex than it appears. Anyone who tried explaining them to a person whose language doesn't have these can testify to that. But children learn this system of articles quite clearly and easily without any help. Noam Chomsky has a few interesting and persuasive theories. What do you think?
Well, I think that Noam Chomsky, he's people may know him today because of his political ideas, but he got his start as a linguist, and he did a lot of work on English and what he called a universal grammar that is a kind of conceptual structure underlying all human languages. And he argued that the capacity to learn language is innate, and we're programmed as humans to try to learn language. If we're exposed to language, we're going to learn it. And we do that by noting the characteristics of the language we're surrounded by and how it relates to these underlying commonalities or universal grammar that we then cash out in terms of the actual grammar of the language that we're exposed to as children. Now, not all of Chomsky's linguistic ideas have had enduring success. You know, there are criticisms of some of them, but others have made genuine, long-standing contributions to linguistics. And I've studied this area. I used to read linguistics books for fun. Linguistics is not the same as learning a language. That's language acquisition or language study. Linguistics is studying the phenomenon of language as a phenomenon. And so I used to read linguistics books for fun. I even thought about getting a master's in linguistics just for for the fun of it or for self-improvement value. But Chomsky's ideas have a significant amount of acceptance, and I think he's right that children are born with an innate framework for learning the grammar of human languages and an innate impulse to try to do that. However, it does take them years of language exposure and practice to learn the details of the system. They typically notice patterns in the language that they hear around them and then apply these patterns and then have to be corrected, at least in exceptional cases. So it's a process of listening, theory formulation, application, and correction. And, to give an example, a child may notice that in English, we form the past tense by adding ed or ed to the end of a word. And so they may then hear, something like the verb swim, like you swim in a pool, and they may say something like, I swim to the pool, where they take the ed and apply it to the verb swim. But then they're going to get corrected because swim is an irregular verb and it doesn't follow the ed convention. We don't say swimmed. Instead, this is an older English verb, and so it involves a different form of pluralization that English used to use, which is an internal vowel shift. So we don't say I swimmed, we say I swam. And also, if they said I swam to the pool, you would also want to correct them. It's not just I swam the pool, it's I swam in the pool, because English also requires a preposition before pool in this case. Now, it is true that it is often thought, I should say not true, but it is often thought that children have a unique knack for picking up languages that shuts off at some point. And there's some justification for that idea in that there are reports of feral children who never became proficient language users. They were kept in extreme isolation, for example, chained to a bed in a room for the first 8 years of their life. And once contact with normal humans happened, once their captivity got discovered, they learned a few words, but they never became proficient language users. So it seems like you need to acquire some language by a certain age if you're going to be a proficient language user. Also, children seem to have a special knack for picking up the detailed sounds of the language as their brains are forming. In fact, we've discovered that similar sounds get connected with centers that are far apart in the brain, whereas if a sound is if two sounds are similar but very rare, then there will be just one spot in the brain to handle them. And this is why Japanese speakers often have difficulty distinguishing between the L and R sounds. So right and light tend to sound the same to a Japanese person. Incidentally, English speakers have the same problem distinguishing between two forms of the letter P when they learn Hindi, because there's actually more than one P noise, and we make them without realizing it. For example, if you listen to the word pop, and I'm pronouncing it in a deliberate way with the final plosive, which you don't normally use in Arkansas English, you just say pop. But if you listen to it this way, pop, there are two different forms of the P in that word. The first form lacks a plosive ending where there's a burst of air from the lips, but the second has it, pop. And English speakers do this without even thinking about it. But in Hindi, these are two separate letters. And so because most of us didn't grow up with a clearly distinguished two versions of P, most of us do not notice the difference between them. And kids who are surrounded by a language do pick up the sounds really easily. And they will notice if you hear L and R distinguished from each other, you will grow up with widely separated spots for L and R in your brain. But if you grew up with no clear distinction between the two P's, you're just going to have one spot in your brain and not notice the difference between them. And that does seem to shut off at some age. It becomes harder for adults learning a language that has a different set of sounds to be able to learn how to recognize and say the new sounds. It's much harder for adults than it is kids. That leaves us, though, with grammar and vocabulary. It's not just about the sounds that kids hear, but the grammar that connects words and the vocabulary of the words. And there's this idea that, kids just hoover that up. Well, okay, they do a little bit during certain phases of their development, but there's also, I think that their ability has been somewhat exaggerated because kids also have another disadvantage, which is actually an advantage when it comes to learning languages. They've got no other way to communicate. So you're a little baby and everyone around you is speaking a language and you don't. You have no other way to communicate. I mean, you can scream, but that's not going to tell people what you want. And so you are highly motivated as a child to learn language, and you have no other job in the world but to sit around and listen to the adults and try to figure out what they're saying. Whereas if you're an adult and you're trying to learn a language, you can always default back to your native language. And you have another job besides and need to devote times to other things than listening to these language speakers and trying to figure out how they're communicating. That's one reason why adult language learners don't do as well as kids, because they don't have to learn the new language to be able to communicate, and they've got other stuff going on in their lives. That's why the best language learning for adults is, if it's not the only, but the best language learning for adults is put them in an immersion camp where people will refuse to speak to them unless they use the new language. In any event, the reason that adults don't do as well as children, I think, is partially because they just aren't motivated as much as children are, given their circumstances. And I hope those thoughts are helpful.
And I think that's about all the time we have. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Join a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to go on pilgrimage to the mysterious shrines and sites of Italy in the Jubilee year 2025 with Jimmy Akin and me, Dom Bettinelli. Go with us on a 12-day, all-inclusive tour that gives you incredible access to Jimmy's insights in Rome, Assisi, Orvieto, Monte Cassino, San Giovanni Rotondo, the Grotto of St. Michael, and more. We're also planning special activities like recording on location for future episodes of Mysterious World, and an in-person Weird Questions episode just for pilgrims. Space is limited and filling up, so be sure to find out more. Visit mysterious.fm/Italy 2025 to reserve your spot today. That's mysterious.fm/Italy 2025. We hope you enjoyed this Patron's Question show. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is only possible because of the generosity of our patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to support Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and have your questions answered on future shows for patrons, please go to sqpn.com/give. And again, you can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/341. So, what are your theories about any of the patron questions that Jimmy answered? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, in the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. Check it out by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And I'm working on building my channel. I'm trying to get up to that 100,000 subscriber barrier, which I think may unlock more views from YouTube. I think they may show the podcast to more people. So please help me out. Help me get there by liking, commenting, subscribing, and hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have new Jimmy Akin video goodness for you, which I try to have every single day.
So, Jimmy, what are we going to be talking about next time?
Next time, we are going to be looking at exorcism. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the two rites of exorcism, the 1614 rite and the 1998 rite. And it will be eye-opening for many people.
Excellent. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.